What's up, everybody? Happy Monday. Hope everyone had a great weekend. Shad's out sick today, so I've got the helm of the show. We're going to be talking about politics for the next 45 minutes. Everybody's favorite topic. I'm just joking. I don't want to take the show there whatsoever, as we've gotten far away from politics. Tape looked good today. I know that I tweeted out that someone must know something. I don't know anything. It's nice to see the tape. I mean, I know that we're sitting at prices from last Wednesday. Market's been not following the IWM and the lift in the broad market after we got the rate cuts, with expected rate cuts going into the future. But it's nice to see green tape. Yes, Hours of Venture. There's going to be very little talk about politics today. Bringing on Hirsh again for a conversation about more of like the state of the union as it relates to cannabis, running through hemp, running through ballot initiatives, Ohio, Michigan, running through some markets. And then, by the way, guys, anything that you want to ask, feel free to ask it in the chat. We'll bring up some of the questions after we go through all of the headlines, and anything that you guys might want to ask it, fire away. We'll pull those up. But I guess without further ado, Arns, bring up Hirsch. Let's get started. What's going on, man? How's it going?
AB, great to be with you.
Yeah, it's good to run it back. We've got a couple of good things since we last spoke. I think it was the ALJ hearing happened after I think we had the last episode, and then we got Trump coming out in full support of cannabis, which I think that's probably the last time we mentioned him on this episode. But no, it's good to have you back, and I'm looking forward to running through the headlines.
Yeah, a lot has happened, right? A couple weeks go by and so much happened. So yeah, there's a lot to talk about.
No dull moments in cannabis land. So I mean, just to kick it off, I mean, ballot initiatives. Obviously, Amendment 3 is something that I'm very focused on. I know that we talked a lot about it. There's a couple of other ballot initiatives coming on the come election day, come the first week in November. I mean, what are you seeing? I mean, how are you feeling? Let's, I guess, start with Amendment 3, and we can roll through, because I know that when we were speaking off, Kramer, you were talking about potentially going 5 for 5 on those ballot initiatives, and you did nail the Ohio one with proof being taken off the timeline. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm pretty optimistic that we go 5 for 5, and I'll kind of lay out my thinking. I think North Dakota will be close again, as I discussed before. I'll mention quickly before getting to Florida, we all know there's 3 adult use initiatives, right? So there's the 2 Dakotas, and then there's Florida, and there's 2 medical ones in Arkansas and Nebraska. Just a quick caveat there. The 3 adult use ones have qualified, and the Nebraska and Arkansas ones have technically almost qualified. There's a couple of legal issues there. I think people may know this. I just wanted to flag it that in Nebraska, one dude turned in fraudulent, petitions. So there's the challenge going on there. There's something similar in Arkansas, but I still think they'll make it on the ballot. They're just not official yet. Okay. So I think we'll go 5 for 5. And again, I'll kind of, obviously nobody knows, but I'll kind of lay out my thinking as to why. Before we get to Florida, I just want to highlight why I think these states are so important, right? So first of all, these are 5 deep red states, and we're already living in a world where there's kind of a narrative, right? I think we saw the Forbes article yesterday that said how Republicans learned to love cannabis legalization. And I get that some people took issue with that headline, but it's a growing part of the narrative that red states might opt in. And then just to kind of state the obvious, right? If these were to all pass, we'd have 27 adult use states, which would get us over that tipping point. We'd get close to 40 medical states. So even the smaller states, I think, matter here. And then finally, and then we'll get to Florida in a second, I think we've talked about how these 5 ballot initiatives, the 15 like big politicians that represent these states, right? The 2 senators from each of these states and the governors, like these are some of the loudest prohibitionists in America. So just imagine a world where these go well. Like, how might that impact people's ability to speak at a December 2nd?
Now, do you foresee them kind of potentially getting in the way in, let's say, Nebraska, where I forget the Nebraska governor's name, but he is very outspoken against cannabis, both medical and adult use. And is that kind of what has brought the scrutiny against the ballot initiative that we're seeing?
Totally. So you're right. This guy, Pete Ricketts, is like famous in cannabis. Yes. He was the guy who said cannabis is going to kill your kids, right? So he's like the loudest prohibitionist in America. He used to be the governor. Now he's the senator. What I would just say is there's a lot of, the guy who filed a challenge, the state senator who filed a challenge to this petition is an ally of his, right? So yes, it is the prohibitionist in forces in Nebraska who are trying to hold this measure down. But as we'll discuss, like just based on my reading of the poll data, I think Nebraska will get close to 70% of the vote. And I know we want to talk about Florida first, but that's just quick there. And so it's a good, I think all of these initiatives are good opportunities to sort of show how prohibitionists are out of touch with their constituents, which is why this is such a big opportunity. But I can start with Florida.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on Florida. I know that we were, you had a lofty goal, or I guess lofty number come election day. I'm all for it. I mean, I know that you kind of take a deep dive into things and you have a pretty even keel as it relates to sentiment. So, I mean, definitely interested to hear your calculus as per the numbers in Florida.
Totally. I'll lay out my thinking on Florida. And just a caveat, like obviously I'm not psychic, I'm not pretending to be, but I do think you can make pretty educated guesses, right, based on empirical data and, focus less on what I will call vibes, right, which aren't really always a good predictor of sentiment. But so here's why, if you were to put a gun to my head, right, and you were like, Hirsh, you have to pick this correctly, like what will the outcome be? My answer would be, and I've said this for, probably 6 months now, or 5 or 6 months, is 66%, right? And so why do I pick that number, right? I'll kind of lay out my thinking, and I get that there are counter arguments, that we can address. The first is polling. Look, I realize there have been a million polls, but I tend to focus on, the polls that are ranked of the highest quality, right? So those are polls like the University of North Florida, like the Fox News poll, the Emerson College poll. These are all some of the most respected pollsters in America. And they have consistently had this measure, 65, 66, 67, 68%. And look, I realize there have been other polls, right, run by the Chamber of Commerce, who is opposing this initiative, that are much lower, right? Although, those sometimes are often close to 60. Basically, I put my faith in what I consider to be the most respected pollsters. I would also add that when Joe Gruters, right, who was critical in this Trump endorsement, was asked, hey, like, why did Trump get on board? I mean, look at his comments. He said, actually, it was a pretty easy call. Like, we have this polling between 64 to 68%. So at least Joe Gruters and Donald Trump seem to approve of these polls. And just last thing on polling, I know that there's a certain narrative like, don't trust the polls. Like, I get that. Polling is an inexact science. And, you should run an election like you're 20 points behind. But at the same time, right, when you've seen a ton of polls, you can't discount polling entirely. And there's a way over time to identify what different credible polls are. So number one is the polling. I'll give you like a handful of reasons. And then we can talk about some of the counter arguments. The second, right, is just that abortion will also be on the ballot as well. That tends to be a huge kind of driver of turnout. And if I just think about turnout generally, right, it'll be a presidential election, which tends to have like really, really high turnout, right? There's abortion on the ballot, which will drive incremental turnout. And then crucially, Kamala Harris is only down by a couple of points in Florida.
Correct.
And I get it, right? There are Democratic partisans who are saying Florida's going to go blue, and like we all laugh at them. And look, Florida's probably not going to go blue, but regardless of your politics, you want as many Kamala Harris voters at the polls as possible, right? Because Democrats will support this measure by about a 75% margin, and Republicans will support it by about a 57% margin. And so, I'll just say when we look at the exit polls, like I think what'll happen is we'll look and we'll see, okay, as was predicted back in May, Democrats support this measure by 75% margins, and Republicans are under that, just under 60. And then, a few more things I'll mention. I mentioned the presidential election, but I just want to mention it again, right? We've seen a ton of ballot measures over the past 10 to 15 years, but they kick ass in presidential elections. Cannabis ballot measures are 15-1. Even, anyone familiar with politics knows there's a different electorate that votes, right, during presidential elections. And I guess a different way of saying this, Anthony, is if this were 2022 or 2026 and you were like, hey, man, how many of these 5 initiatives are going to pass? I would say, I don't know, maybe 1 or 2, right?
Yeah, that's a valid point.
Right? I mean, I would be nervous if this were an off-cycle election, but I'm not. And then I guess a few more things I'll mention is the fundraising, right? So the Smart and Safe campaign has raised more than $100 million. It has $30 million on hand for this last month and a half. So anyone who thought that the campaign was going to get complacent or was being arrogant, I mean, just look at the slew of endorsements. Right before we got on, we got Ricky Williams. We have state senators from both parties, right? We have, the El Presidente, right? I'm forgetting.
Dave Portnoy. Yeah.
I lost his name for a second. So there's that. And then I guess a few more things I'll say, right? Just going back to the medical vote, right? When Florida passed medical, and I know it's just medical, but in 2016, when Trump beat Clinton like 49-48 in Florida, medical got 70, almost 72% of the vote, right? That
Yeah.
shows how broadly kind of bipartisan this issue is. And the final thing I'll say is I know that there's been a line of thinking that says, like, hey, like no red state has ever, voted with the 60% margin. Just to kind of comment on that and not to get too far, and to make this like a politics lesson, right? But like, Arizona hit 60%. And if I think about
Mhm.
Arizona, right, like they've only, before Joe Biden won Arizona in 2020, a Democrat had only won Arizona once, right, in the
Okay.
previous 70 years, going back to Harry Truman. I mean, I'm, again, not to make this a history lesson, but Clinton won
Yeah.
Arizona in 96, and it had been, like almost 70 years going back to Truman. So Florida is much more swingy, right? Barack Obama won Florida twice. So I disagree with this idea regarding a red state. And then the other thing I'll note is just there has never been a red state that has not had 900,000 medical patients before, right? There's never
Correct.
been a red state that has $100 million campaign. You and I were talking before we got on air, Anthony. The Ohio campaign raised $2 million.
I didn't realize that. That's wild as far as capital allocation goes towards the cause. And they did the poll. I wasn't even, I mean, I do get your thesis on the presidential election. Like that does bring more people out, and it definitely puts more butts in seat. It gets more people to the polls.
Totally.
As far as that stuff goes. So with Florida being a battleground state, do you foresee Kamala potentially coming out and endorsing 3? Or do you think that she continues to just keep status quo, be quiet on the cannabis issue, and we've got our date December 2nd with the ALJ hearing, and that's that? Because they have toned down the rhetoric as it relates to their political content that they've been putting out. They stopped with the reclassifying or reclassified in the past tense of marijuana, and now they're using I think triggered the reclassification process as
Totally.
far as it goes from a semantics perspective.
Yeah, I mean, look, I have a lot of friends who work on the Kamala campaign, and I'm constantly arguing with them about this topic. I think it's a huge political misstep that she's failed to endorse Amendment 3. Her voters overwhelmingly support it. Like, on what other issue do you have a
Yeah.
75% margin, and do you fail to engage there? So I think that is a mistake. It's also a mistake because she has leaned into the abortion rights issue. Like, she literally did a reproductive rights tour through the state of Florida with Florida Democrats. So she's already on the ground there and weighing in on other issues. So I don't think it makes sense that she's failed to engage. The answer that I'm constantly getting is that the people in her ear don't think it's a significant enough issue for her to weigh in on. But I would say a lot of times these political professionals are out of touch with ordinary people. So I think it's a huge missed opportunity. I think it would benefit her in the state. The counter argument you could make, right, is that, hey, maybe we don't want her endorsing it because that might turn off some Republicans, right, who've used this as an issue. That could,
I was just going to say that.
For sure. I think it's true. And I think for that reason, maybe the amendment, both the abortion rights and the Amendment 3 folks, they've tried to present this as a nonpartisan campaign. They're like, sure, we want your support, but we don't want you to think of this as a Democrat-run measure. And Ron DeSantis is doing everything he can, right, to make people think of this as a Democrat-run measure. So a bit of a missed opportunity, but I don't think it'll be damaging to the campaign. And again, it seems to me this is a campaign that is leaving everything out on the field. I think obviously 66 might sound bold to some people, but that's what my reading of the data tells me. And I think there's this phenomenon in cannabis where we're scared to acknowledge positive news, that we might jinx something. But like, I don't think what I say is going to impact Kim Rivers and her putting her foot on the gas. And so this is, I just think, a fair reading of the data at this point.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's definitely a fair assumption. I'm keeping the number in my head of 62. I'll be very happy if we get 66. To me, that's a grand slam. As most of the people, like you just alluded to, I mean, really kind of like to temper my expectations. But even if it's 60.1, we win, we got the number, and we're there. So, I mean, yeah, 66% would be a very, whether it's 60.1 or whether it's 66, doesn't really matter on election day. We just got to get over that 60% hurdle. And then obviously go into the implementation phase, which will be interesting because we'll get the sidecar legislation that Joe Gruters is doing to curb public consumption. We'll actually be able to get into the process of implementation and really see what DeSantis is going to do. I mean, but as some people have asked, once that amendment passes, it's getting ratified into the Constitution. There's no blocking it. There's no vetoing it. Ron DeSantis cannot stifle the will of the Florida people. It's coming whether he likes it or not if that passes on election day. And I mean, that getting into, I guess, the next headline. I mean, one thing that we talked about a lot the last time was Ohio. Do you think that Ohio really has shifted the calculus as it relates to cannabis within the GOP and within red states? It's kind of just, oh, well, we can look to Ohio. They brought adult use online. Well, they haven't brought adult use fully online yet. They are bringing and implementing full adult use here very shortly. It didn't change to California or Seattle or one of the other states they want to point to that's legalized marijuana, that on the right, they tend to say, well, it's been this great disruptor. It's not. It's actually been shown to decrease crime, to increase tax revenue that gets allocated towards social initiatives, and be a net positive in the community. I forget what poll it was, but Colorado actually had an exit poll. I think it was 3 years after adult use was implemented, and not everyone, but a majority said it was a net positive to the state after. Do you really believe that Ohio has kind of shifted the political calculus as it relates to the views on the cannabis industry?
Yeah, I think we're already seeing signs that Ohio has shifted the politics in its neighboring states, and I think over time we will see more of its impact. I just want to quick comment on what you said earlier regarding Florida. Last thing I'll say there is we should note that there is a history of the Florida GOP trying to modify different ballot initiatives that have been passed. There was like the 2018 ballot initiative where felons got their voting rights back, and then the GOP passed a law saying, yeah, you can get your voting rights back, but you have to pay a bunch of fines and fees to get it back. And so this is probably a separate conversation, but I think the stronger the vote in November, the stronger our hand is, to prevent anyone from monkeying with the initiative. Just like in Ohio, that 57% vote provided some support. So I agree with the spirit of your comment, but I do think we need to be watchful about what certain forces in the Florida GOP might do. And that's why I'm so excited to get every single vote that we possibly can to run up that margin of victory.
Great point.
Yeah. On Ohio, I think you can say that Ohio has already started to shift the politics of its neighboring states. And I think that's something that you and I have chatted about a little bit briefly online. If you just look at the neighboring states in Ohio, what has happened since then, right? So, and by the way, it should bear note, if anyone hasn't been to Ohio, each of the states that Ohio borders those border regions are very culturally similar to the area it borders, right? Like Eastern Ohio, where Youngstown is quite similar to Pittsburgh and being very Rust Belt, right? Ohio, that borders Appalachia, right, is Appalachian Ohio. Okay. So these are very similar cultures, and I think some people from coastal America might not always appreciate that. And so, right, they don't know those nuances. And so, look, my answer to your question is emphatically yes. You are already starting to see Ohio impact its neighbors. Now, why do I say that? Since Ohio passed November, in Kentucky, right, the Democratic governor, Andy Beshear, has expedited the implementation of the medical cannabis law. And for anyone who thinks that, a Democrat running on cannabis in a red state is political suicide, Andy Beshear, a Democrat, right, in Kentucky, won re-election by 5 points running on an emphatic cannabis program, right? In the same way, if you look at those really Trumpy, like Appalachian counties in Ohio, right, they voted for issue 2 in Ohio. Right. So Kentucky, right. Anyone who has been to Kentucky, a beautiful state, knows that Louisville and Lexington are just right up there near Cincinnati. So you're seeing Kentucky expedite its program. And then again, two other things that people don't pay attention to that I think are super exciting, but go under the radar a little bit, are the organic change you're starting to see and happen in places like West Virginia and Indiana. Right. And so now that Ohio is online, every single person in the state of Indiana lives 2 hours or less away from a dispensary, either in Ohio or in Michigan or in Illinois.
Okay.
I mean, just look at a map of Indiana, right? And it's like, so that explains why the Democratic governor or gubernatorial candidate of Indiana, first time this has ever happened, has come out with an adult use plan, Jennifer McCormick. And then the Republican, the guy who's probably going to win the governor's race in Indiana, in response, Mike Braun, again, a super conservative Republican, has said, okay, I'm fine with med. And yeah, we can talk about adult use, but let's get law enforcement involved in the conversation, which I think is the way that Republicans are going to approach this. So Look,
Yeah,
is weed going to be legal in Indiana next week? No, but that is huge that both candidates are running on cannabis reform, even though one is doing so in their Republican way. And
yeah.
then, I'll just mention West Virginia. Again, people might be like, why do we care about West Virginia, right? But the Democratic gubernatorial candidate in West Virginia, a guy named Steve Williams, right, is running on a very pro-cannabis platform. And you should see some of the language he's using to call
He's
out
running on a pro cannabis platform.
pro cannabis. Yeah. I mean, so from
Okay.
West Virginia, he's saying, I want to legalize adult use cannabis. The first time, right, a Democratic gubernatorial candidate will win. And I'll just quick caveat. I actually know Steve Williams, a little bit. Before I worked in cannabis, I worked with him on some other policy issues. This is a guy who has been deeply committed to eradicating the opioid crisis, right?
That's what I was going to, yeah.
I mean, he is deep. Like if you Google his name, look at all of the work that he has done to combat the opioid epidemic. The fact that we have someone running for governor in West Virginia, right, which might be the reddest state in America, right? Like in their Democratic primary, they voted for a guy in prison over Barack Obama. I mean, just if you guys remember that when Barack
Yeah.
Obama was running for re-election in West Virginia, they voted, they gave their votes to some random dude in prison over Obama. That's how red it is. So I guess the point is, now in deep red West Virginia, you have a Democratic gubernatorial candidate that is emphatically, right, calling out his opponent for being a merchant of death with opioids, right,
Okay.
for not being pro-cannabis. So I guess the point is, I'm not going to pretend that, West Virginia and Indiana are the most important states, but there's no
No.
way to deny just the significant organic movement. And that's a result of the fact that they border Ohio. And then just last thing I'll say on this topic is we've talked Pennsylvania to death. I believe Ohio will finally be the impetus for Pennsylvania moving next year, and moving past the very difficult divided politics they have in that state with very urban minority communities and very rural, white communities. And the other thing I'll say is I think Florida will just be a rerun of this entire story, right? Florida will start the adult use conversation in the deep South. I mean, and just one anecdote I'll share is I guarantee you, and again, I'm optimistic that Florida will pass. When Florida has its next governor's race, right, and all the Democratic candidates are jockeying for who's going to, run for governor in 26, right? So late next year when that starts, I guarantee you adult use cannabis is going to be a central part of the Democratic platform. And then, Republicans in Georgia generally, nominate moderate governors. And so they're going to move in that direction. So these are the slow organic changes that show you that we're making progress. Again, it doesn't happen overnight, but it is happening.
Yeah. No, it is. And I mean, I know we spoke about it early in the process when Ohio came online about it shifting the political calculus. And we've seen it over the past, let's say, 3 months transpire to more states getting vocal about it, more people in the GOP coming out in favor of cannabis, in favor of rescheduling, sensible legislation. And then you get Donald Trump coming out and just fully endorsing safe 3. No one should be in jail for cannabis, just sensible cannabis legislation. So I mean, it's good to see it. It's great to see it coming from the top. And I mean, another market that it kind of caught my eye was Michigan. I mean, Michigan, I think, put up 295 million last month in sales. I know that we kind of went back and forth about what your outlook was for Ohio in terms of getting up to that threshold of, let's say, 2 to 3 billion in sales. Are you seeing anything internally or having any conversations, like firsthand accounts of like how Michigan is doing this and what's driving that engine? Because tracking the 3 billion in sales from Michigan in light of starting to have competition come on around them is pretty damn impressive.
Super impressive. Yeah. I mean, Michigan is now on pace to do 3.3 billion in 2024 sales, which will be a new record, right? Amazing. And so Michigan had an outstanding month. One, not to get too wonky here, I will caution people that those numbers will go down a little bit next month now. And some people might wrongly attribute that to Ohio. Now, why will they go down? Again, September has 30 days rather than 31. I know these are small things, but you're going to see that 295 number go down to like 270. So it's the days. Right. The other one is that, summer's over, right? Not as many people are in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan on September 24th as they are on August 24th. And then not to get too wonky, but you see this affecting numbers. August was one of those months that had 5 Fridays and 5 Saturdays, and Fridays and Saturdays are like some of the biggest of sales, right? And so September, and it also, again, not to make this too wonky, we got, Labor Day, right? Wasn't until the 2nd. So you had all of those sales on Friday, August 30th, all of those sales on Saturday, August 31st, and then you had Sunday, September 1st. So there's little small things like that that introduce some noise into the data. So I think, you're going to see that 295 number go down to like 275 right next month. Not a huge deal. I point that out because there might be some people who see that number and be like, oh, Ohio is finally making a dent. But it's like, well, there's other factors like number of days that matter there. With all of those caveats aside, Michigan is on fire. Now, why is Michigan on fire? Because Michigan looks like the cannabis market of the future, right? Michigan is a market in which it is affordable for blue collar people, right? People who work in the auto industry to be able to purchase cannabis. I think we've all seen the anecdotes that a vape pen that costs $10 in Michigan, right, costs $30 or $40 in Ohio, right? So it's affordable. And it's also reasonably, right, convenient to access. You have 800 dispensaries in Michigan. It's akin to a liquor store. So Michigan shows the immense economic potential of this industry if it's regulated in a rational way, right? And it also shows how many, I don't hear as much, right, about intoxicating hemp cannabinoids in Michigan, for example, because when people have the option to purchase the real thing, right, that is tested, then they'll do so, right? So Michigan's on fire. And what I would just say about the relationship between Ohio, and Michigan, I think the reason we haven't seen sales dip in yet, although I think we will over time, is one, if you just look at a map of the Ohio dispensaries, right? So Northwest Ohio is the part that borders Michigan near Toledo.
Yes.
And so there's only 7 or 8, if you pull up at some point that map of, Ohio, you'll see there's only 7 or 8 dispensaries that have set up there yet, right? For good reason, because when the program was starting, they're like, no one's going to come to this med store, right? They're going to go to Michigan. So that will change over time, right? Because the state, pledges to have an equal distribution of licenses by population. But right now, all the stores are concentrated not near Michigan, right? And so that's part of it. The other thing that we talked about last time that I think is worth surfacing, people may not know this, the new product limits, right? Buying pre-rolls and stuff, right? And the elimination of the tenths, that was supposed to expire on September 7th. The state has been somewhat delayed there. I mean, I check in with the folks I work with often, and they're hoping that by the end of the month, they'll finally get the go-ahead to sell their full slew of products. But we should know that the state it was supposed to be September 7th. I haven't heard a good reason as to why it's been delayed. We're hoping that in a week or two, normal products can be sold. I think that continues to be a limiting factor. And then a couple other things I'll flag, Anthony, is it's still weird to me that some of these med stores haven't opened up yet, right? There's about 10 med stores that haven't converted. I don't know why MariMed hasn't opened its Ohio store in Tiffin. I would love to hear a reason for that. And I've tweeted about that. I think that's part of it. And then the two things that I think will help boost, right, sales kind of going forward is we've already seen 7 as of today of these what are called 10B stores, right? So there's the 134 medical stores, then there's the 170 new what are called 10B stores. Already 7 of them have their provisionals. David Goubert at Air, I know he's gone now, but was saying, hey, we're going to open those new stores by December or so before the end of the year. So, when those stores open, that'll help. And then as supply increases and as pricing goes down, some people will rethink that calculus. Do I want to drive 45 minutes, right, to Southern Michigan? So
it's it's a tough value proposition. I mean, I don't drive over 10 minutes to another dispensary if I don't have to. I mean, I'm whatever's closest works. I mean, granted, I'm not very price sensitive when it comes to cannabis products, so I'm definitely not going to drive out of my way to save a couple of bucks. I'd much rather have the convenience. But I mean, I can understand that. I mean, do you think the prices? Because I mean, I saw the product that was coming out of Ohio was premium priced, which is obviously expected from a supply and demand perspective when a med market flips to an adult use market. Do you expect that curve to start to tail down over time, let's say in the next 18 to 24 months? I'm not saying get to the prices of Michigan, but start to normalize and see that more friendly consumer pricing come into the market, especially when you get that extra 170 retail locations coming online?
Yeah, I think that's right. I don't think Ohio prices will ever be competitive with Michigan's. Michigan has such an open licensing structure that it enables those low prices. And then the other weird thing, Anthony, is that, Michigan really took off during COVID, right? If you think about it, the first Michigan sales happened in December 2019, right? And then COVID happened a few months later. And so the Michigan market took shape during this period where we all thought, during 2020 that this was going to last forever, right? And so that that continues to impact the amount of supply in the market. So I think Ohio will start to compete with Michigan pricing. In other words, that $10 Michigan vape, right, is going to be $20 or $25 in Ohio rather than $40 now. And then I think, the super stoners who, let's be honest, maybe, reselling some of that on the illicit market will probably still go to Michigan. But I think most people after a while will say it does not make sense for me to spend an hour and a half and a ton of gas money up there by driving up there. But it will take time. And so I'll just say, last thing on Ohio I'll say is, I think unlike other states, right, like if you think about a Missouri or a Maryland, like they kind of got to where they were at, and maybe there was some incremental ticking up, right? But quickly within adult use sales starting, they reached 90% of their potential, right? Ohio has reached 50% of its potential at its or less than that, at its $1 billion run rate. And we will see, similar to Michigan, we will see that uptick over time in Ohio.
Yeah, one thing I guess to go back on, let's say the Rust Belt, the Southeast, what we kind of see as potentially driving growth for the sector, or at least starting to come online with the passing of adult use in Florida and some of their other neighboring states. You see hemp everywhere. Hemp is everywhere in the Southeast. It's everywhere in Texas, Rust Belt, Midwest. I mean, what are you like? How are you looking at hemp right now? Like, I'm talking to some people saying that we're going to see it get re-rated in the Farm Bill, much like what we see cannabis, which would make sense, as THC is THC, regardless of the loophole that we're going through in the Farm Bill right now, as far as the dry weight BS, like 5 milligrams of THC, whether it's hemp derived, or 5 milligrams of THC, whether it's cannabis derived, it's the same compound. I mean, they need to be regulated the same. They need to be sold through the same systems. They need to be in the same sector. Right now, we're operating just completely out of each other's purview, and they need to come together and I guess get reined in. Like, what's your take on hemp? And I mean, where do you see that going in the near term to mid?
Totally. I'll offer a few observations, but obviously this is such a big topic. I won't be able to cover all the really important arguments and counter arguments. I think the first thing that we're seeing is a bifurcation between states that have adult use programs and those that don't, in terms of their regulatory approaches, right? In recent weeks, we've seen California, we've seen New Jersey, we've seen Missouri. A lot of those actions, even if they're presented as public health rationales, and maybe they are sometimes, a lot of times that's because of a desire to support the cannabis businesses, or in California, a desire.
Okay, let me ask you one thing to follow up on that. And I said this last week. Do you think that there is a need for hemp products in a full adult use cannabis market?
I think that if we take Michigan, right, as an example of a full, if by full we mean like easy, convenient access, like affordable, I would say, and again, I'm not a chemist, I'm not an expert, I'm sure there's stuff I don't know about. I would say the demand for these products is low or negligible in a world in which you can obtain the real thing. And I think that's kind of hard to dispute, right? That when
totally.
And
I mean, I have a hard time usually getting out of my frame of reference to things, but I can't think of a reason why, if I lived in California, why I would buy THCA flower, hemp-derived edibles, hemp-derived products versus the traditional cannabis products, with the caveat of beverage. I have not seen or consumed a beverage that is the same quality of the hemp-derived stuff in the traditional market, but I don't understand for the life of me why you would choose to ingest those products when you have access to safe, trusted, regulated, traditional cannabis products.
Totally. I agree with you, but let me play devil's advocate just a little bit, although I do agree with you. Right? I think the reason a person in California might consume those products is, as you know, they might live in a local jurisdiction that doesn't have legal cannabis access, right? Or the taxes might be so high that that cannabis might be unaffordable, right? So I think Michigan is the example where it's like, hey, like this is affordable, this is convenient, whereas in a lot of California, that isn't true. And then the other thing I would note is, again, I totally agree with you, right? Public health should be top of mind for us. And I, as a consumer, wouldn't want to purchase illicit products. But, as someone who is a staunch advocate for the cannabis or the marijuana industry, we have to clean up some of these testing issues if we want to say with credibility, right, that these products, these marijuana or cannabis products, are safe products. And, California, as you know well, in recent weeks has had huge scandals about its testing regime. So unless we get our house in order, right, we're not going to be able to make that argument with credibility. And then look, I agree with the spirit of what you said at the outset, which is like, this is all one plant, right? I think eventually we will move towards a system in which these artificial distinctions no longer kind of apply. And look, I think there are things that the cannabis industry can take from the hemp industry, right? The fact
Yeah.
that, you know, the hemp industry is available in normal sales channels. Like, we've seen a lot of people don't want to go into a dispensary. I don't know why it
No.
took us so long to realize this, but now we realize it. People want to shop where they normally shop. And that's a lesson that the cannabis industry has to take from hemp, right? It can't ignore that lesson.
That's a very dangerous statement, though, when you look at the models that we're investing in right now, as a lot of the major MSOs, even a lot of the private cannabis companies, there is heavy investment in brick and mortar. I
Totally.
do agree with you, though. I mean, my mom, my wife, they won't go to a cannabis dispensary. Would they gladly pick up gummies or beverages at Publix or even Total Wine or a liquor store? Yeah. I don't have these. I obviously don't have this view as I see the cannabis dispensary as an informative and friendly experience, but there's a lot of people that do see it under the lens of being potentially taboo. Like they see it as an intimidating sales experience versus something that should be actually informational. And if you go to the right dispensary that has the right bud tenders, that has the right programs, it's where you really should be purchasing the product so you can understand what you're buying, what the potential effects are, and how, obviously not how the substance interacts with the body, as then you're getting more into, let's say, a medical conversation, which I don't think should be had within a dispensary. But dispensaries do help more than they harm. We as an industry need to kind of work on the public perception of them, that it's your friend. It's not really a hindrance or something that you should not feel comfortable going into. Maybe make them more welcoming.
Totally. Yeah, I agree with what you said. And maybe I would revise what I said a little bit just to say, like, look, I have concerns about, you know, highly intoxicating products, right, being available in normal
Yes.
sales channels. I think there's a clear logic behind having a special retail outlet, as we do for pharmacies, for products
Yeah.
that are intoxicating. And so at a high level, what seems to make sense is what has been mentioned before, that there's an avenue for lower dose products that are available in
Yeah.
normal sales channels, that the dispensary functions for higher dose products. And I agree with what you were saying regarding beverages, right? While some hemp products may be seen as a competitive threat, I am at least a believer, right? I'm sure you and I, we enjoy smoking things, right? And
Yeah.
are familiar with cannabis. Most people aren't. And it seems to make sense to me that introducing people to cannabis through a familiar format like beverages in a normal
Oh, yeah.
sales channel can be a conduit for them visiting a dispensary down the road. And I think, you know, maybe one other comment I'll make is we tend to think of this in a zero sum way, but our goal here is to grow the pie. Our real competition is
Yes.
alcohol, is pharmaceuticals, right? And so instead of fighting for scraps, right? And that's what I see happening in California. People for fighting for scraps of a broken system, right? And are worried that they're not going to survive. We need to be expanding the pie and focusing on the real competitors we have that exist outside.
Yeah,
Not
yeah. I mean, the barbarians are at the gates. I mean, you had the beer lobby in California clapping with standing ovation on the hemp crackdown. I'm sure they have their qualms as it relates to the traditional cannabis industry as well. And I mean, in states like Minnesota, you're seeing the beverages just eat into market share of liquor. And these are generational businesses. These are people that don't like to see stats like, oh, 13% of our market share has been eroded last month due to cannabis beverages at point of sale for liquor. That is alarming. But we need to be careful, and it needs to be done delicately because the liquor lobby is very powerful. I mean, liquor overall, I think in the U.S. is 260 billion in
Wow.
revenue. I mean, they're about 10. They got us at about 10-1, and they've got the pockets of politicians and influence in Washington. The last thing I really want to do is poke that bear and hit that bee's nest, and then they start coming for us, because we need to come together as industries. I really see the long game is alcohol and cannabis. They're analogous as far as the sales channels go and the distribution channels. And I mean, it's a sin. It's a sin substance. You obviously can take it a step further. Cannabis has medical applications. Cannabis is seen as a medical, I don't want to say medical medium, but medical substance. Alcohol, I can't really name something that's beneficial from ingesting it, aside from it's a good social lubricant,
Wow. Yeah.
which can be overused, and then you have a hangover the next day. That's being phased out. I think we're seeing a generational shift away from alcohol, but we need to have the alcohol industry embrace us, not look at us like the new kid on the block that's just stealing money out of their pocket, hand over fist. And that's what I think is going to contribute to the hemp industry getting reeled in. It's not going to be the cannabis industry lobbying against hemp. It's going to be the alcohol guys being like, oh, they're eating our market share. Like, we're now on notice and they're in our stores. We need to do something about this. So I'm very curious to see what happens with the farm bill. I don't think it gets addressed in lame duck as far as the hemp stuff goes, but I think the hemp stuff does get re-rated here in short order, because it needs to be, because we need some common sense back to the cannabis side of the equation. And hemp just operating as the Wild West is not doing us any favors.
Totally.
Right
Yeah.
now.
I agree with all that, especially the point about the alcohol lobby being really powerful. And the only other thing I'll say is if I, when we see all of these hemp bans in different states, if I were a hemp operator in Florida, a good hemp operator, what I would be thinking, rather than trying to fight Amendment 3, I would be thinking about how I build inroads there. And so in this new regulated world that emerges, right, next year, how do I ensure, right, that I have a piece of that pie and can be integrated into that framework? And how do I self-regulate in that way? Because otherwise Ron DeSantis is coming for you. I hate to break it to you. And so how do I ally myself with the plant medicine community?
Ron, this is all obviously purely speculative, but I firmly believe we are going to see a hemp crackdown in the state of Florida after the election. He got the money from that. He got the money from the hemp people. There's no way Ron wants this hemp stuff just rampant in Florida. Why not pass adult use, silo it into dispensaries, take it out of gas stations in a truly regulated system that has integrity and that has checks and balances to make sure that it's not getting in the hands of minors. You're not creating these HHCP and THCP and Delta 8 sprayed flower. Those products, consumers don't need them. Like, those are just novel products. Have your core products that are hemp derived, cannabis derived, one system. And I really do think that's where Florida kind of gets to in the long haul. And then, one big headline that we've had was the DEA basically coming out and saying, hey, the two-step process that was used, we're acknowledging it, and we are going to acknowledge its legitimacy. I got some flack for saying the DEA was on our side. DEA is not on our side. As it relates to the two-step process, I think that was huge, because now you have the OLC memo that also said, hey, this is a legitimate process. This is to be used in the highest regard. DEA backs that. I think that is a very positive point going into the ALJ hearing. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
I completely agree. I think you said it well, right? The DEA acknowledging that this two-part test is legitimate is really positive for rescheduling. Obviously, we'll still speculate about the exact timing for rescheduling and how many days the hearing might last, right? But we all know, right, that this two-part test, and for folks who may not know, the DEA has traditionally relied upon a five-part test in determining whether something should be rescheduled, right? And in this instance, the HHS recommended a two-part test, which basically says, does cannabis or does anything have widespread medical use by licensed healthcare providers that are operating in compliance with state law, right? And that's one of the great benefits of the now close to 40 medical programs that have emerged across the country. And we all read that HHS memo and how in detail it cited that medical efficacy. So look, we'll still speculate on timing. I think it's hard to dispute the fact that this is enormously positive, especially considering, smart approaches from marijuana had signaled that this was a central part of their legal challenge. So I think that's enormously positive. And just going back to what we were talking about earlier, right? We could have Nebraska and Arkansas, two red states, by what I consider wide margins, kind of validate that same thesis, right? That's what people are doing when they're passing medical programs, is saying cannabis has medical value. And so I think all of these things in conjunction make me a continued optimist, even if we're still playing a waiting game.
Yeah. Speaking of smart approaches to marijuana, actually, Luke Niforodis is going to be debating John Morgan tomorrow night in Tampa at I think it's the Young Republicans of Florida. We're currently trying to live stream it. I'm working with one of the chairs over there to potentially be able to live stream and get it on. I'm very curious to watch this. It's going to be, I think, a hell of a debate. John Morgan, for those that don't know, is a hell of a trial attorney. And Luke is going to come armed with the regular Sam talking points. As you just alluded to, that chink in the armor and the questioning of that 2-point process. As far as I'm concerned, with the DEA and the OLC memo combined, there's no real questioning that, especially in a court of law, as you've got one of the highest bodies in the judicial being the OLC coming in and saying it, and then you've got the DEA. I was shocked. to see the DEA. But they're going to have a debate tomorrow night on Amendment 3 and the viability of cannabis in the state of Florida, which I'm assuming there's going to be fireworks. So we will be trying to get that feed and covering that. I mean, with that being said, I mean, does anybody have any questions out there for either of us? I know I saw some of them in the feed. Have I tried Canadian beverages? Yes. And this is not a plug, but the Canopy Growth ones, they had these grapefruit seltzers that were amazing. That came in a 6-pack. It's one of actually the best seltzers I've tried on the market. Why did you act like a Colorado? Oh, he's acting. Yes, Kevin Sabet was for those that don't know, Kevin Sabet Luke was in Kevin Sabet's ear on a telecast. And I know that we dog on these guys, but someone's got to be the prohibitionist in the equation. I don't agree with them, but I respect at least Luke. Luke doesn't go around blocking people on Twitter. He engages in the conversation, and he usually actually creates good conversations, which is why I'm actually looking forward to it last night. And then Anthony Hirsch, do you think the 2-part test will make it easier to reschedule other drugs like psilocybin? I'll let Hirsch take that one if
that's a good question. I'm not an expert on.
Same.
Yeah,
same. That's a good question.
I mean, I think I believe, from my personal experience, that psilocybin has immense medical potential for sure.
Same.
100%. And I think we're on that path, right, towards recognizing its medical utility. I'll say, I mean, it's hard really to say, right, because this 2-part test focuses on whether in healthcare professionals are using this in a licensed fashion. We obviously have seen an explosion of that when it comes to cannabis. I don't think we're nearly at that point when it comes to psilocybin. We just have kind of decrim measures. So I think we're kind of a long ways away there. I think maybe that's my answer, right? I think that 2-part only comes into play when at the state level this is happening in a robust way.
So Jose, keying back to what Hirsch said, DeSantis cannot block it, but they can fight to augment it. So I'm going to use probably the most extreme example possible. Amendment 3 passes, adult use cannabis comes online, and there's an onerous tax that just makes it completely unaffordable for anybody to buy. They can mess with it like that, but then you're talking about probably injunctions and legal challenges to that. And then he's not acting in good faith of the people. It's a very, very, very slippery slope for the Florida GOP if Amendment 3 passes and they go completely against the will of the people and just try to make it an onerous measure that doesn't make sense in practice. At least that's my perspective on it.
Totally. And I'll just add to that by saying, look, you mentioned the taxes. Another thing they could technically do, I mean, I don't think they'd be able to, is impose like a 5% potency cap or something, right? That would kind of respect the will of the people, right? But would be a law that they could pass. So they could kind of mess with it, right? So it's technically possible, but I will say that's why I think the margin of victory is so important, right? Just like the more votes we can get, and just think about, DeSantis has been a pain, but think about what an opportunity this is to repudiate after like the sitting governor who just won by 60% to totally repudiate his positions on these issues. That'll send a really loud message. So I think that's the opportunity. And the other thing I wanted to say is DeSantis can only do that if he has a GOP supermajority, but in part because of the enthusiasm behind the abortion and the cannabis initiatives, Democrats in Florida are contesting every statewide legislative seat for the first time in like a decade. So if you erode that GOP supermajority, if he just has a majority, then it'll be a lot harder for him to pass one of these laws. And so that's why
voting blue down ballot in Florida, plus voting yes on Amendment 3 is playing a little bit of offense. Or offense or defense, I guess, whichever way you want to say it. But yes, JT, the Miami Dolphins season, it's over. That's all I want to talk about. Yesterday was rough. They got killed. Love Tua. Hope he comes back. Our season's done. Let's see.
Niners lost yesterday too. That was a heartbreaker. Lost to the Rams. Dude, that was just really bad.
You guys got hit with the injury bug pretty hard. You had one receiver. I never heard of him. He had 175 yards and 3 touchdowns. I'm assuming it was the only guy on the field. Schumer silence. We're not talking about safe, guys. Safe is it'll come when it comes, as far as safe goes.
I think you'll hear a lot of speculation in the lame duck. I'll just offer, like, those things are really hard to predict. I mean, just imagine a world where the Democrats kicked ass in the election, right? They would be like, why do we want to pass? Like, imagine where they won a trifecta. They'd be like, we want to do our thing in 2025, right? Or even if they didn't, imagine a world where Mike Johnson, the Republican Speaker of the House, just doesn't play ball, right? So it's really hard to game out what'll happen in the lame duck, although obviously we're all hoping.
Yeah, I've been hoping for some time that the conversation in Louisiana, I forget the gentleman's name, but he's getting louder and louder on bringing sensible cannabis regulation to Louisiana, starts to filter into Speaker Johnson's brain, and he starts to get a sensible approach to it. I think Donald also just set the tone, like, guys, this is not the boogeyman. It's socially acceptable. It's polling very high. The American people want it. The old guard / institutions that are still within the government, that have never left the government, are the problem. They don't want the change.
Totally. And I'll just say on Trump real quick. I mean, I am of the belief that Trump will have, and I want to give him his flowers here, right? Like, we'll have a really significant impact on legislators, but more of a minor impact on voters. I mean, I really appreciate what he did, but I think about when Obama came out in favor of gay marriage in 2012, the interesting thing is that data said that had no real impact on the Democratic electorate and what they thought, but it did mean that all of the politicians within a year coalesced around him, right? He hadn't said anything for 3 years. Then he comes out in favor of gay marriage. And then all of his fellow politicians seek political cover by allying themselves with the principle. And so that, I think, is the real power. What Trump did is he will move Republicans over time, elected ones, I think, a little bit more than voters. So.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a good note to end on. Hirsh, this has been real. Obviously, it's great talk as per usual. I'm sure we'll run this back in the next 4 to 6 weeks or so, and look forward to having you back on the program in due time.
Thanks, AV. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Arns. All right, everybody. We are going to sign off for now. We'll be back to our regularly scheduled program on Wednesday. Shad will be back, I'm assuming. He's just got the flu, feeling under the weather. And then we'll be on Twitter to let everybody know if we're going to pull off the live stream tomorrow. Like I said, I'm working with the Young Republicans of Tampa to get the live stream set up, and then we'll simulcast it through the channel. If we can simulcast it through the channel, everybody will know probably tomorrow morning to tomorrow afternoon, and we'll keep everybody apprised of that. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in, and look forward to seeing you all on Wednesday.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching our latest podcast. Lots of momentum building. You guys getting all excited? Leave comments below. Again, we want to take this viral. Smash that like button and make sure to click on that bell for all notifications as we start to bring on bigger and bigger guests. Don't forget to subscribe to our daily newsletter, the Baked In newsletter, by logging on to thedalesreport.com. And we want to take this viral, as I said, and make this community grow. So make sure to subscribe on that channel, because we wouldn't be here without you. Thanks again, everyone, for watching.